pleasure of introducing my friend John Speth from the University of Michigan. He's a University of Michigan professor emeritus of anthropology who specializes in hunter-gatherers, past and present in the Old West and the New World. And he's going to speak to us about the beginnings of Plains-Pueblo interaction, the view from southeastern New Mexico. Are you there, John?
Yep, I'm here.
So. Oh, good, good, good. Thank you. I wish I could see everybody.
Well, should I go ahead?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, thanks to all of you for tuning in. Thanks to all of you also for the invitation to do this. I realize the topic is a bit far afield from Michigan, and right now it's pretty miserable weather out there, just like here. But at any rate, it's an interesting topic in the Southwest, and there are aspects to this topic that I think many of you may find of interest more generally about hunter-gatherers, not just in terms of the relationship with Pueblo farmers, but problems of earning a living when a lot of your food comes from hunting. What I want to do tonight is to weave some older stuff that I published a number of years ago together with some brand new stuff, and out of it to come up with some things that I think are new. They're somewhat counterintuitive in various ways. They have implications for a lot of other types of questions, not just Plains-Pueblo interaction. And some of the things I'm going to touch on fairly briefly, but if we have time, I have no schedule tonight. So afterwards, I'm perfectly happy to stick around and answer questions if anybody is in the mood. At any rate, a couple of little notes here. If you have a picture of me on your screen or device or whatever, and I keep turning somewhat to the side, my eyes aren't so good. The camera's on my laptop, but I can't read my laptop. So I have to turn slightly to look at an external monitor next to it, and I apologize for that. So at any rate, with that, let's go ahead. Pueblo, Plains, oops, that's not responding, so let us try it here. Plains-Pueblo interaction is an old issue. The Spanish described it. Some of the earliest expeditions into the Southwest, Coronado in 1540, and some of the people that were with the Coronado expedition described Plains-Pueblo interaction. And many of the later expeditions in the late 1500s, 1600s, and then right on into the historic and later historic and fairly recent periods, 19th century, describe it. And so there's been a lot of interest in it. When it began, why it happened, how it happened, and so forth. And it's an interesting problem, and it has a lot of different parts to it that are intriguing in their own right. So let me begin with what I would say is the most common view of Plains-Pueblo interaction. It's kind of the standard, and then what some of the implications of that view are, and then I will begin to question some of them, challenge some of them, and go from there. The usual view of Plains-Pueblo interaction is that you had dedicated farmers, the Pueblos, who were sedentary or largely sedentary, heavily committed to farming. They were the one side of this equation, and the other side are assumed to have been nomadic bison hunting specialists. And that's a key part of it. In other words, it's presumed that most of their living was earned by hunting bison and living off the products, the meat, the fat, and hides, and so forth of bison, which they traded with the Pueblos for corn, plus all sorts of other things. Now, based on a lot of archaeology and historic documents, given that sort of basic model, nomadic bison hunting specialists interacting with dedicated farmers, and I'll show you some of the actual quotes from the Spanish documents. That assumes that the interaction began when you had nomads in the southern plains. That's usually assumed to be the Athabascans. That's a linguistic term that includes both the Navajos and the Apaches. And they are believed to have arrived in the southern plains. There's a lot of debate about this, but during the protohistoric, which is typically started by archaeologists in the area at around AD 1450. In other words, that's the Apaches or their ancestors are thought to have been in the more northerly parts of the Southwest in northern Utah and so forth somewhat earlier. But in the southern plains, many feel that they didn't arrive until about AD 1450. And that's when this interaction with the Pueblos really gets underway. The standard view of this interaction, it's often called mutualism, in which these bison specialists are closely tied with exchange with farmers. The Spanish describe it in that fashion, and they don't use that terminology, but one of the assumptions, of course, is that they understood what they saw and that they understood how it worked. And even that, I think, is open to question. If you think about who the Spaniards were dealing with in Spain, with the Moors, their own biases and attitudes towards gypsies or Roma and so forth, and you bring those attitudes into the New World, one begins to question perhaps some of their views of these nomadic peoples that they were witnessing. It also assumes that they overwintered at the Pueblos. And there are a number of these early Spanish accounts that talk about them coming to the Pueblos and spending the winter there. In order to do that, there had to be an exchange of food. It didn't make sense for Plains people to bring their own food all the way to the Pueblos and then sit there and eat it themselves. Presumably what the Spanish are describing, they're bringing goods to trade. But while they're trading, the assumption is that the Pueblos provided them with maize to keep them, to tide them over basically while they're there. And without horses, there's no way they could easily take enough maize to keep them going and haul it back to the plains. That would, you could do computer simulations and you'd find that it just isn't practical. Once you have horses, the whole calculus changes. Now, there's a lot of debate about this food exchange, and many people say, no, that wasn't why there was all this interaction. There were lots of other reasons, political, conflict, alliance, ceremonies, intermarriage, and so forth. And this view does not preclude these other, in other words, there had to be exchange of food. It does not preclude these other reasons that they interacted. And I'm sure there were all kinds of other things that were going on. They weren't just there to eat or to trade material items. There are a lot of social, political, and other activities that went on in this. So let me show you a couple of these early quotes and you'll see where this basic model comes from. And you know, if you're using a very small device like an iPhone to hook up to this, I'll read it to you, but for those with a computer, this may be a bit redundant. This is Coronado in 1540. These people follow the cows meaning bison. These people follow the cows, hunting them and tanning their skins to take to the settlements in the winter to sell. Since they go there to pass the winter, each company going to those which are nearest, some to the settlements at Sicuyu, which was the early Spanish term for Pecos, which for those of you not familiar with the Southwest, Pecos is a very large pueblo just to the east of Santa Fe. Others went towards Quivira, which is thought to be Kansas, and others towards the settlements which are situated in the direction of Florida. So if they're doing this overwintering, there had to be some food exchange, regardless of whatever else they were doing while they were there. The Oñate expedition, which came into New Mexico in 1598, has another nice description. Along the way, we met some Apache Indians who follow the buffalo and kill them for their fat and tallow, which they sell and trade to the Pueblo Indians for corn, blankets, and tobacco. These Indians live in rancherias, which they move from place to place. They pack their huts, which are made of hides, on some small dogs. These natives do not grow anything, depending entirely for their food on the meat of the cattle they kill. So there is your reliance that's the bison hunting specialization. They're not growing, they're not cultivating, they are living off the bison. And I will justify this assertion later. That diet is impossible. You'd have to be an Eskimo. You'd need whales, seals, walruses, and so forth if you're going to survive that way. It doesn't mean that bison weren't extremely important, but you can earn their living that way. And I will elaborate on that, and it has some really interesting implications when you follow that out. All right, so when the conventional view, when did this emerge? As I indicated, it's probably in the protohistoric. This is the conventional view. This may be unfamiliar to many of you. It's after what's called the Medio period at Casas Grandes. Casas Grandes is a huge site in northern Chihuahua. If you can visualize New Mexico, on its southwest corner, there's a little boot heel that sticks out. In fact, I'm going to go ahead one slide and then come back. Look at, this is New Mexico. Look at the far southwestern corner of this image, and you'll see that boot hill. And Casas Grandes is just to the south of that in Chihuahua. So at any rate, the Medio period is largely in the 1300s. And the Medio period has come to its end before this Plains-Pueblo interaction supposedly really got underway. It led to a change in exchange networks. During the Medio period of Casas Grandes, it's assumed that there was a major exchange network that was oriented largely north-south, coming out of Casas Grandes and out of northern Mexico. And then with the emergence of Plains-Pueblo interaction and the demise, if you like, of Casas Grandes, this exchange network shifted to an east-west pattern that presumably linked the Pueblos with these nomadic bison hunters out on the plains. So let's look at the implications of this, the nutritional implications. And I'm going to start with work I did quite a while ago in New Mexico at a bison kill called the Guernsey Bison Kill. This is the old stuff, and then I will link it to new stuff to come up with what I think is some rather counterintuitive views of what all this might imply. The Guernsey Bison Kill is a rather small site by bison kill standards. It's located in a town, or near a town you all know and love, Roswell, New Mexico. It's still inhabited by aliens. And it's along the Pecos River in southeastern New Mexico. And the bison kill, for those of you who have been in Roswell, if you haven't missed much. But if you've been there, it's Roswell's on the west side of the Pecos, very close to the river. And the Guernsey Bison Kill is just across the river on the east side. It's late prehistoric, just bordering protohistoric, AD 1450. There are multiple kills there. It's not a single event. There are many small events. They occurred during the spring, during the calving season, probably largely during the month of March. Each event, they varied in the number of animals killed, but sort of on average about 6 to 8 animals. And what's intriguing, or one of the intriguing things about it, is their primary targets were bulls. They took nearly 70% bulls, about 30% cows. And that's the reverse of the standard image of prehistoric bison kills. If you look at the kills that have been reported on in Wyoming, Montana, Alberta, and so forth, many of them, I would say the majority of them, are fall-winter kills, and they're targeting cows and calves, particularly cows. So this is kind of the reverse of that. It's spring instead of fall, winter, and they're targeting bulls instead of cows. The image that you see on the bottom right is a typical thing here. This is a cow, it's a female. As I will get into in more detail, the whole front end is articulated. They basically threw it away. They didn't use it. So, and this is a pattern that was widespread. The little projectile point there, I don't have a scale for you. They're called Washita points. My daughter, when she was young, called these Christmas trees. For those of you familiar with the archaeology of the eastern US, in the late woodland, they have Madison points. These are little triangles like the Madison points, but with side notches. And this is the dominant point type. All right, for some of you, you'll be familiar with this kind of graph. For some, this may be new, so let me take a little bit of time to explain what's what here. What we're looking at, all these little abbreviations are different skeletal elements, different parts of the carcass of the bison. And what you're looking at is the food value of each of these different parts. And the way that was calculated, that's the general utility index. Very briefly, the way that was calculated was to take each anatomical part, upper hind leg, lower hind leg, upper front leg, lower front leg, neck vertebrae, other parts of the spine, the skull itself, the pelvis, et cetera, the rib units and so forth. And figure out on each one of these different anatomical units how much meat there is, the meat weight. And then take the element which has the most meat, give that a value of 100%, and then calculate the percentage represented by all the other parts. So they're sort of standardized, turned into percentages of the most meaty part. And so rather than being the absolute meat weights, these utility indexes use a percentage of the meatiest part. And then, but it's not just meat. Hunter-gatherers generally are interested also in the marrow, particularly in the fat in the marrow that is inside the shafts. And and the volume of marrow in the different elements varies quite considerably. Some have a very large marrow cavity, other bones have relatively small marrow cavities. And so basically, again, the marrow utility, so you had a meat utility, then you have a marrow utility, which is to calculate the volume of the marrow, and then take the part with the most marrow, set that at 100%, and then calculate the percentage represented by all these other, the marrow and all the other bones, and you have a marrow utility index. Then you do the same thing with the grease, and that's the fats that are in the spongy tissue of the joints. And you do exactly the same thing and come up with a grease utility index. And then combine them all together into a general utility index. And that's what's plotted here. So a value of 100% means for those three separate values, the grease, the marrow, and the total meat, the parts with a value up at the 100% end of the utility scale have a very high food value, and down towards the zero end have a very low food value. Now looking at the vertical axis, this is a little harder to visualize perhaps, but when you dig a site, you rarely get rarely dig the whole site. And so when you get bones, you don't necessarily have every animal that was killed. And what you get is a sample. So you lay out all the different elements. And you know that, let's say, if you have one animal, it has one skull, but it'll have two upper front limbs, two humeri, and it'll have two upper rear limbs, two femurs, and so forth. And it'll have one bison has 14 thoracic vertebrae. So if you have one head, you should expect, if you had a whole carcass, that you would have 14 thoracics. And you can do the same with the bones in the feet and all the other bones. That's how many you would expect. So you then look at all your different elements, skulls, vertebrae, and so forth, and figure out which element, was it the skulls, the thoracics, the femurs, et cetera, which one gives you the estimate of the largest estimate of the number of animals that had to be killed to produce the sample that you have. And at Guernsey, it was skulls. There were 35 skulls. So if you had 35 skulls, they must have killed at least 35 animals. That means there should be at least 70 humeri, a left and a right. And there should be at least 70 femurs and so forth. But there aren't, because the Indians carried off a lot of them. And bear in mind, what you're looking at in this graph is not what they took away, it's what they threw away. It's what they left at the kill. So what you can see is that the head and neck units, they didn't want them. All right, they basically abandoned a lot of them on the site. And as you move down to other skeletal elements, and the details of which ones are which in these symbols here doesn't really matter, they took about 70% on average of everything else. All right, they left about 30% of the expected on the site. This is a very typical curve that one gets when you analyze bison kills. They are throwing away a fair amount, but they're taking away an even greater proportion. No surprise here. But I went ahead then and sexed all of these elements, figured out which ones were males and which ones were female. And with bison, that's fortunately very easy because the male is twice the size of the female. And so you don't need to be a rocket scientist to lay the bones out on the table and say, oh, this is, it's huge, it's a male. This is tiny, it's a female. There's some that are harder than others, but basically it's pretty easy to sex them. When you sex them, this is what you get. The red is female, the blue is male. The shapes of each curve for each sex is still the same, all right? They're dumping a lot of the low utility parts and taking a fairly high percentage of everything else. But the real surprise for me came when you realized that for almost every body part, when they threw stuff away, they were more likely to throw away the female part than the male part. Now you have to bear in mind that they killed, these are animals they had already killed. And yet for some reason, they didn't want the female parts. And that is what began, for quite a while, I couldn't make sense of it. I was beating my head against the wall trying to figure it out. But to make a long story short, think back, these are spring kills. This is the calving season. It's March, possibly extending into April. In the southern plains, the rains don't come until mid to late summer. That's when the grasses begin to green up. So you have cows that are subsisting on mediocre forage, but many are pregnant or already nursing a calf. So there's a huge calorie demand. And the question is, where do they get the energy from if the forage is really poor? And the answer is they're getting it from their body fat. So that raised the next question. And for a while, I couldn't figure what the problem was with that. What's wrong with lean meat? Why didn't they like females if the body parts were fat depleted? And I'll give you one quote or read you one quote that's from an explorer who was exploring in the Texas Panhandle in the 1860s rather, well, 50s and 60s. We tried the meat of horse, colt, and mules, all of which were in a starved condition, and of course not very tender, juicy, or nutritious. We consumed the enormous amount of from 5 to 6 pounds of this meat per man daily, but continued to grow weak and thin until at the expiration of 12 days, we were able to perform but little labor and were continually craving for fat meat. The literature, the ethnohistoric literature, there are hundreds and hundreds of these quotes from all over the world. If meat was fat depleted, they basically could eat tremendous quantities of it and still continue to starve to death. And Lewis and Clark is another example. In February, they ran out of food. They sent a hunting party out. They came back and said, we killed 16 buffalo and 40 elk, but they were too lean for use. In other words, they just basically abandoned them. And as I say, there are hundreds of those. So the question is, what is wrong with this? Why is this a problem? So I looked at the pemmican literature. Now, pemmican was the mainstay of the fur trade, but it was also the mainstay of a lot of Native Americans and First Nation peoples. Pemmican basically is lean meat, and they picked the leanest meat possible, removed whatever fat they could from it. And bear in mind that wild animals like deer, bison, and so forth are much leaner than the leanest meat you can buy in the grocery store, because the muscle is not marbled with fat, whereas domestic animals are. So what they did was then take the leanest meat on the animal, which typically was from the thighs. These are the steaks that we love and that Native Americans usually fed to their dogs, because it has no fat. And they would then dry it and pound it into a powder and mix it with fat. And the typical ratio, and again, there are, in the ethnohistoric literature going back to the 1600s, there are endless descriptions of how you have to make pemmican. And it has to be a mixture that's roughly 50-50 meat, lean meat, which I'm taking to be largely protein, because the water is gone and there's hardly any fat in it. And roughly the same weight of fat. Now, you can calculate then how much protein percentage-wise is actually in it. And I've done the calculation below just to tell you, you don't have to go through it, but basically what it is, a gram of fat is equal to about 9 calories, and a gram of protein is about 4 calories. So when you take 40 pounds of fat, which they're describing in that quote, and 50 pounds of protein, the lean meat, and multiply them by the appropriate figure there, you come out for the 90 pounds that pemmican would have weighed with a figure of about 250,000 calories, 35% of which is protein. And that was considered the maximum healthy limit. And if you had pemmican with that ratio, basically 65% fat and 35% protein, and often it was 70% fat and 30% protein, you could live, if you kept it dry, you could live for an entire year without anything else, and they often did. So all this concern about we eat too much fat, part of the problem is we don't exercise, and part of the problem is chemically a very different type of fat. So what does the nutrition literature have to say about it? Well, it turns out it's rate limited. What has to happen, protein contains amino acids. The amino acids contain nitrogen. The body, the liver has to deaminize the protein and convert it to urea so you can excrete it in your urine. But it's rate limited. And it's in part dependent on your body weight. Within a 24-hour period, you are limited to about, not as I said, it depends on your body weight, to about, let's say roughly not more than about 250 grams of protein. Now, if you convert that into typical lean meat, that is, you add the water to it, you're talking about a little over 1 kilo of fresh meat, or about 2.5 pounds. That gives you a figure. You are limited, your liver simply cannot handle more than about 2.5 pounds of lean meat per day. All right. Above that, it becomes toxic. You start building up ammonia in the blood. There are a lot of other issues with it. And if you keep that up for 2 or 3 weeks, you could end up dying. And that's one of the dangers of the Atkins diet. If you really take a very strict Atkins diet with a very high protein intake, it can actually be quite dangerous. So let's move on. So basically keep this in mind. It varies by body weight, and the limit is not really a percentage of calories, because if you just think of it in terms of percentage, you can say, well, if I ate more fat, I could eat more protein. It's actually a limit in grams per kilogram of your body weight. And for, let's say, an individual of 65 or 70 kilograms, the limit would be around 250 grams of protein per day, which comes out, let's say, for 2,500 calories a day. That would be about 30 to 35% of your calories. That's the upper limit. Above that, you're in trouble. So now let's take a classic bison kill. And this is new stuff. It's called Olson-Chubbuck. It was excavated many years ago. But the analysis, reanalysis I did on this was, for me, was completely counterintuitive, actually, until I did this. It's a late Paleo-Indian bison kill in southeastern Colorado. And I think it's probably still the best documented bison kill in the literature, particularly because of the incredibly thorough exploration the author did. It's a guy named Joe Benwheat. The literature search this guy did of the ethnohistory of bison hunting, the amount of fat you can get from bison, the meat weights that you got off of bison, off of males, off of females, off of juveniles, and so forth. It's an unusual kill in that it's a jump, but not off a cliff. It's actually into an arroyo from the side. And there are about 190 animals in it. And it's of an early form of bison, which is about 25% larger in body size than modern bison. So it's a pretty big critter. Benwheat interprets it as a single event, and I have not seen anybody challenge that. There have been challenges to the seasonality determination, but basically it's 190 animals that appear to have been taken in a single event. One of the intriguing things about it is the animals were only partly utilized. And this has always been a mystery. And it turns out there are many bison kills. In fact, I'd say the majority where a sizable part of the kill is not utilized, only partly utilized. And this is where the counterintuitive part begins to come in. 74% of those 190 animals were completely utilized, 16% only partially, and 10% there's no evidence that anything was done to them. They're completely articulated. Now, Benwheat, like most people, assumed that, meat is meat, you can eat as much as you want. So the reason they didn't butcher all of these completely was it was too hard to get at them. And yeah, that's possible. I'm dubious, but let's say that that is a possibility. But he provided tremendous detail. How much meat, he estimated how much meat they would get, how much tallow, how much marrow from these 190 animals, adjusting for the fact that they're larger than modern bison, adjusting for the percentage that were females, the percentage that were males, the percentage that were juveniles. In other words, he broke it down in tremendous detail. And so I went through and did the same calculations we just went through, looking at the number of calories that it would generate. And you come up with an average fat percentage of about 7.5% fat on these animals, using his figures, Benwheat's figures. And that is a figure for animals in pretty good condition. 10% would be animals in whoppingly good condition, prime condition. So 7.5% is not bad for a wild ungulate. 3% would be fair condition. So these animals are, if these figures are reasonably accurate, these are animals that are in pretty good condition. They're not starving animals. But when you calculate the percentage of protein, it's almost 20% above the maximum threshold that people can use. There just ain't enough fat on these animals, even in good condition, to be usable. And I did the reverse calculation, that is, how many more animals they'd have to kill in order to get enough fat to use all of the lean that they got in the first 190. And they'd have to kill more than 100 additional animals just to make use of the lean that they got from the first 190. In other words, they probably, now they could feed some of it to dogs, but then you get into the question, how many dogs did they have and how much could you possibly feed to these poor animals? And it's more likely that a lot of this was thrown away, simply discarded. And as I mentioned, when you start looking at bison kills more generally, particularly from Paleo-Indian and early Archaic, there are a lot of animals that are only partially utilized. They're still articulated. The limb bones haven't been broken open for their marrow and so forth. They're clearly just stripping stuff off of them, probably mostly targeting fat and throwing away a lot of the lean meat. This is what's so counterintuitive about a lot of this. This just seems to run counter to what we would expect a sane behavior to be, but it actually makes total sense nutritionally. Now, I did the same thing, I'll go through this really briefly, with modern ungulates, not using an archaeological data set, just taking modern ungulates, one in fair condition 3% body fat in an ungulate in excellent condition with 10% body fat, and calculated, assuming that they could not eat more than 2.5 pounds per person of fresh meat, lean meat from the animal. With an animal in poor condition, they would still be missing half of their total daily calories. In other words, there simply is not enough fat in this animal to make it. They would have to go after an additional half of their daily fare from other animals, stripping them just for fat, or targeting plants. And we'll come back to that in a moment. Even animals in absolutely peak condition, they're still missing 30% of their calories. In other words, they can't get that 30%, no matter how much of these prime condition animals they eat. They have to get it. They have to get the point is they have to get 30% of their calories that are not protein. That can be fat or carbs. It can be either one or both, but it can't be additional protein. Otherwise, they go into what is often called rabbit starvation. So here's a quote, and I'm starting to collect these, and I've got hundreds of them. The Indians, this is from 1829. The observations were actually made quite a bit earlier. The Indians kill caribou with a bow and arrow or gun, or spear them in crossing rivers or lakes. The Eskimo also take them in traps ingeniously formed of ice or snow. A single family of Indians will sometimes destroy 200 or 300 in a few weeks, and in many cases they are killed for the sake of their tongues alone. And as I indicated in a little note at the end, the tongue is one of the fattest organs in the body. And when an animal is stressed, it's one of the fat reserves that is not mobilized, it's not utilized. So it becomes one of the absolute choicest body parts, regardless of the condition of the animal. And now I may also explore in the wolf literature, and I won't go into that here, but wolves are doing the same damn thing. The alpha males often only eat the tongues in the carcasses they kill. And the problem with a wildlife biologist, they look, it's difficult data to get, but in the wolf biology, they do such a song and dance trying to explain why wolves surplus kill. They often kill many more animals and abandon large parts of them. And they assume, well, it was the condition of the prey or other factors, or they just like doing it. They get in a frenzy and they can't think of anything better to do. I've only found one study so far that actually looks at what body parts they target, and guess what? They're going after the fattest body parts. So I have the feeling that a lot of Native Americans were very observant and perhaps learned a heck of a lot from the behavior of wolves in the wild. Okay, so alternative strategies. Actually, let me back up. Well, at the top of this, I say one strategy is to select the fattest animals by taxa. So like beavers, you go for the tail. That's the fattest part. In bison, you go for the sex that's fattest at a given time of year, and then you go for the fattest body parts in that sex at that time of year. That's one strategy. That's what we saw at the Guernsey bison kill. Another one is to harvest wild plants, focus on carbs or plant oils. Now, archaeologists keep saying over and over again, and they're right, plants don't preserve, we don't have that kind of data. So they pay lip service to it and move on. And that's not gonna cut it. There is a huge amount of data in ethnobotanies. We have tons of computer simulations, agent-based modeling, all kinds of other stuff, but mostly focused on hunting. You could do the same thing with plant foods. Tell us what plant foods are likely to be available at what seasons, how nutritionally valuable are they? Which parts of the plants do you need to utilize? Where are they? Do you have to leave the plains in order to do this? And at what time of year? There's a huge amount of information we could squeeze out of this if archaeologists would stop, complaining that, well, the data are lousy, so we're just going to ignore it. And then another option is exchange with farmers. That's the mutualism where you get carbs from the farmers and you give them the meat. And presumably what you're giving them is mostly the lean. The farmers can use the protein and you need the carbs. if you're the hunter-gatherer. But it requires overwintering until you have horses, because you can't afford to carry enough corn out into the plains to really make good use of it. And another strategy, and this is one I'm going to talk about now, is you cultivate part-time. And this takes us back to good old Roswell in southeastern New Mexico, and to dual economies, a kind of economy which has sort of been ignored in the question of Plains-Pueblo interaction. Bear in mind that people have gone into it with the assumption that you had to have full-time farmers interacting with bison hunting specialists. And I don't think that's the way it began. That may have been the way it ended, sort of. But I don't think that's the way it began. And the work I've been doing in Roswell, I think, points in that direction. So here we are back in Roswell. But this time, instead of being east of the Pecos, we're now just slightly west of the Pecos, still only 11 miles outside the town of Roswell, which I like to affectionately call the armpit of the universe. Actually, out on the ranches, it's absolutely marvelous out there. Henderson is a fairly large pueblo, and I'm using pueblo, emphasizing this, with a small p, because I have no idea if it bears any ethnic or biological or other relationship with the classic pueblos in the Rio Grande, all right? It's pueblo-like in a lot of features. Its architecture, its burial patterns, the kinds of ornaments you find, and the fact that they're doing a lot of farming. The dates are guesstimates, because there are no tree ring dates, unfortunately. There are no trees out there. Actually, I think, let me just move one slide ahead. I'll give you the scenery and then come back to this briefly. That's the landscape. That's my kind of landscape. If they're mountains, I like them to be at least 100 miles away. So anyway, we'll come back to this in a moment. The Pueblo has about 70 rooms, probably single story, and is shaped like a capital E, the letter E, with 3 arms sticking out of a main bar of that Pueblo. They're doing a fair amount of farming. Now, I don't want to get into the details of just how much, but maize ubiquity, archaeologists do a lot of flotation. I think many of you are familiar with that. You take a lot of dirt samples from hearths and storage pits and other things. You throw it in water and hope that plant remains float to the surface. And ubiquity is simply, it doesn't tell you how much. It's simply a measure of how many samples did I throw in water that actually produced at least one fragment of maize, of corn, all right? We found hardly any cobs, hardly any kernels, but we found zillions of the cupules, the things that held the kernels to the cobs. And that's because they're burning the cobs up as kindling. So the ubiquity figure is not a very reliable thing, measure of how much corn was actually in the diet, but it does tell you that there was a fair amount of corn in that site. The manos, these are the hand stones that they use to grind the corn. The grinding surface area is often used by archaeologists in the Southwest as a measure of the, a crude measure of the percent dependence on maize. I think you can see this. The surface area of your grinding stone in a way is correlated to the efficiency with which you can reduce kernels to flour. So the bigger the surface area, the more maize you can reduce to flour in a finite amount of time. And these have the manos have pretty large grinding area. They're definitely growing a fair amount of corn. So here's the site. Again, I'm standing on one of the room blocks. This site will never make the cover of National Geographic. The total relief of these room blocks is about, on average, about 1 foot to 1.5 feet. In fact, when I took undergraduates out there, I'd let them first find the site, and they're walking all over it without a clue. And then you start showing them, well, look at it, pieces of wall sticking out here. Oh, and then after a while I said, Jesus, it's actually pretty big. And then what's in the middle, the thing I've labeled as East Plaza Oven Complex, is a gigantic roasting pit. By gigantic, it's almost 10 meters long, maybe 5 meters wide, 2 meters deep, just crammed to the rim with bison bones and firecracked rock. All right, the next is a map of the site. And I've just overlaid sort of crudely a capital E over this so you can see it. We divided it into 3 south-facing bars and a main bar. And then, I don't know if my cursor, I don't see it, so I can't, here it is. I don't know if you can see the cursor. In the East Plaza out here is a huge roasting complex. That's the one you saw in the previous photograph. This huge roasting complex filled with firecracked rock and all kinds of other stuff, thousands of bison bones, and another one back here. Now, there wasn't much stratigraphy here, which was frustrating, not much depth of deposit. And so I was very frustrated with, I wanted to look at economic change, and if you don't have any stratigraphy, it's kind of hard to do. But we were able to seriate the rims of this one ceramic type. It's called El Paso polychrome. They're very large, thin-walled jars, and their rims thicken and become more everted over time. And using that, we found that the main bar and this roasting feature were early phase. Now the dates I've given way over here are arbitrary, they're guesstimates. Because I didn't have enough money I need 100 radiocarbon dates to really pin this down. And I had money for about 10. So these are kind of crude guesstimates. But at any rate, what I called the early phase, proximate dates, the late 12 or early 1300s, was the main bar, basically a linear room block, probably 5 rooms wide, plus this, what we called the Great Depression. It was a Great Depression because it was a depression in the ground, but also because the crew that I took out there, those poor SOBs, these are Michigan undergrads for the most part. We had 20 days over 100 degrees back to back, 5 of them above 110. No shade anywhere on us. There were no trees out there. And it was windy enough that I gave up trying to set up sunshades because they ended up in the next state within 5 minutes, no matter how I tried to anchor them. And I just didn't have the money to build a permanent structure over it. So it became dubbed the Great Depression. But at any rate, then the late phase, they converted many of these main bar rooms into storerooms and then built these arms onto the Pueblo. And so I didn't have vertical stratigraphy, but I had horizontal stratigraphy, and that proved to be really eye-opening. So I said it's very Pueblo-like in terms of its ceramics, architecture, burial patterns, etc. Ornaments. It's sitting out on the edge of the plains. You could see from that photograph, the scene, it is in the plains, all right? The nearest mountain, and it's not much of a mountain, is roughly 80 miles to the west. And the nearest real mountain range of the Rockies is 120 miles to the west. So we're pretty far out in the boonies there. There's almost nothing plains-like there. I expected to find it. And there are very distinctive cherts, alabates and Edwards Plateau, beveled knives like are illustrated at the bottom right, a cord-marked pottery, which should look very much at home in the eastern United States. This is a common pottery in the late prehistoric Texas Panhandle. We have, well over 100,000 sherds, and I don't think we found a single one. No bison bone tools. And the moment you go out in the plains, around Amarillo, Texas, and the Texas Panhandle and so forth, sites out there that are contemporary with Henderson, you find digging sticks made out of bison limb shafts, scapula hose made from bison scapulae and so forth. We found none of that, absolutely none of that. But we found thousands of bison bones. So it was kind of surprising. So now looking at some of the more detailed analyses, they proved to be kind of interesting. And we'll work our way back into Plains-Pueblo interaction here. I view these roasting features as public features. They're out in the plazas. Everybody can see what's going on out there. Whereas what you do in the rooms and the trash that you dump in abandoned rooms, stuff like that is much more private in a sense. So I plotted the percentage of different taxa, different animal taxa by body weight in these public areas, and then broke them down by early phase and late phase. And no surprise that little things, again, let's see if we can find the cursor here, jackrabbits, prairie dogs, cottontails, there's a lot of fish at this site. Mostly catfish, five different species of catfish. Most of them are disposed of in room trash and were found in room context. So that's kind of domestic stuff. The biggies were found much more of it in the plaza. The most striking is bison, the biggie. And when you break it down by early phase versus late phase, there's a dramatic change. Almost all of the bison in the late phase are found in these public roasting features. And along with it are dogs. And if you look at Plains literature, this is very un-Pueblo-like. If you look at Plains literature, the dog is a feasting animal. It's kind of the equivalent of ham or turkey on a holiday here. When you have honored guests, you serve dog. And many Plains groups do that. And what's happening here is in late phase, there are a lot of nice little puppies butchered out there in these public roasting features. There are other changes as well. In the late phase, in the early phase, there are a lot of bison ribs. In the late phase, their number declines rapidly. Now, bison ribs are a great proxy for dried meat. The rib slabs, you just break them off the bison, you don't butcher them. You break the whole slab off of the bison at the kill, hang it up on a drying rack and let it dry. It has a large surface area to volume, so it's easy to dry, and hence it's easy to transport as a trade item. That doesn't preclude all kinds of other, dried meat and so forth being traded, but we can't see a lot of that. But the sudden drop in bison ribs in the late phase suggests that all of a sudden they are beginning to trade with ribs. Now, immediately someone can react and say, well, maybe the dogs just got busier because ribs are pretty easy to chew up and dogs can have a feast on them. Well, the easy way to check that is there were a fair number of antelope killed at Henderson. And antelope ribs are tiny and delicate. They're more like a white-tailed deer. Actually, they're even smaller than a white-tailed deer. So if dogs are going to destroy ribs, they're going to destroy the antelope much faster than they are the bison ribs, which are pretty big and clunky by comparison. And the antelope ribs show no decline whatsoever. Their frequency stays right up there where you'd expect them. So this to me is a sign of bison trade. And if you look at Pueblo sites 100 miles away to the west that are contemporary with Henderson, there's a lot of bison that shows up in the late prehistoric periods. And lo and behold, it's almost all bison ribs, nothing else. Now, that doesn't mean it came from Henderson, but it's part of that same sort of system. So I think it's in the late phase when dried meat becomes a major trade item. The other thing that happens is in the late phase, and I'll document this more clearly, there's a whopping increase in ceramics that are coming from the Pueblo areas 100 to 200 miles to the west. Still nothing coming off the plains except the bison themselves. So next is a map that shows you the Sacramento Mountains, Sierra Blanca. If you're not familiar with the area, it may be a little hard to visualize. The scale here, roughly from the dotted circle in Roswell to where those arrows are going, is a minimum distance of 100 miles. And to the Salinas area, let's see again if I can point with the cursor, these arrows going up here, it's up to 150 miles away. We're talking about pretty substantial distances. So now I'm going to introduce something else here that we'll look at. There are actually 4 villages, all very close together in Roswell. In fact, one that I'll talk a bit about is Bloom Mound. It's less than a mile from Henderson, and it's just a tad later based on the El Paso rim seriation. All 4 of these sites have almost the same ceramic assemblages, but they differ in age when you seriate those El Paso rims. All right. Now, looking at Henderson and Bloom, when you look at the early phase at Henderson, so bear in mind this is late 1200s, early 1300s, still well before the protohistoric. Only about 2% of the ceramics are coming from more than 100 miles away. That's a fair amount, but it's still pretty small. You get to Henderson's late phase and it jumps to 7%. Now we're getting a pretty big number. And then you get to Bloom Mound, which I would date somewhere in the late 1300s, early 1400s, it jumps to 9%. Now to put that in perspective, probably the largest site in the greater Southwest is Casas Grandes. It's gigantic. It's the one in northern Chihuahua, off the southwestern corner of New Mexico. It has thousands of rooms, and they have plotted or tallied the quantity of non-local ceramics coming into Casas Grandes. And they use as a cutoff for non-local just a little over 50 miles, and it's only 2.5%. So that you can see how Roswell stands out, even though the sites are much smaller. They are far less insular, at least in terms of these long-range exchange networks than Casas. Now, Casas has all kinds of phenomenal goodies, but what seems to happen there, all these goodies went into Casas and never left. And people have begun to rethink the whole role of Casas as a trading center. They don't seem to have been doing all that much trading. They seem to have been accumulating masses of stuff, marine shell, turquoise, and all kinds of other stuff, but it didn't go anywhere else. It just ended up in Casas. So now let's look at those 4 villages, and we're getting close to the end here, and we'll wrap it up. These 4 villages, there were many more villages. Unfortunately, Roswell has gone out of its way to destroy its archaeological record. It's kind of sad. But we have data on 4 of them. 2 of them are pit house villages, and 2 of them are Pueblo-like villages, Henderson and Bloom. Fox Place is a pit house village with round pit houses. Rocky Arroyo, and these are all within just a few miles of each other. Basically, when you stand at Henderson, you could see all the others. They're all within eyesight. Within the greatest distance between these sites is, I think, 7 miles. All right. Fox Place, round pit houses, Rocky Arroyo, square pit houses, Henderson and Bloom, above ground, adobe room blocks. Very Pueblo. When you seriate the El Paso rims, look what happens. You get a classic pit house to Pueblo transition, something that I did not expect at all. Fox Place, a bunch of scattered around small pit houses. Then Rocky Arroyo, just slightly later, based on those rims, with square pit houses that it was gutted by pot hunters, unfortunately, but it looks like these structures were around some kind of a central plaza, whereas there's no indication of a plaza at, it's not clearly at Fox Place. And then at Henderson, you suddenly get this adobe structure, 2 phases, forming this big E-shaped structure. And then Bloom, there's a map of what it looks like. It's just slightly younger than Henderson and less than a mile away. Now, when you superimpose the faunal data and trade data, ceramic data and stuff on top of this, this is what it looks like. The first thing is you get a very rapid aggregation of peoples into these larger, they're not huge by any means, but you get aggregation of people into these larger villages, and you can get into all kinds of interesting debates about what's driving the aggregation. And there's a large literature on this from the Southwest, and it raises some very interesting questions. Looking at Fox Place with these round scattered pit houses, there's almost no bison and almost no trade ceramics. It's really insular. You get to Rocky Arroyo, you still have almost no trade ceramics, but tons of bison. So in other words, bison hunting kicks in before what I would say you have any clear evidence of Plains-Pueblo interaction. They are beginning to bison hunt, but it's not linked to trade. Then at Henderson in the early phase, let me get the cursor going here again. In the early phase, so late 1200s, early 1300s, you still have tons of bison. And again, like Rocky Arroyo, not much trade. So even in this period, there's still not a lot of trade evidence by ceramics from the West. And you still have expected numbers of bison ribs. So there's no proxy for dried meat leaving Henderson in any substantial quantity. When you get to late phase Henderson, so let's say the 1325 to the latter part of the 1300s, tons of bison, lots of trade ceramics, and a sharp decline in ribs. This is when I think Plains-Pueblo interaction kicks in. All right, but bear in mind, we have almost no plains material other than bison. So the trade isn't going both ways. They're getting bison from the plains, but then presumably providing it to pueblos to the west. And this is why I say you're not dealing with bison hunting specialists here. You're dealing with these dual economies. And these farmers are doing their own bison hunting and then taking it further west to other pueblos who do not have access to the plains and trading with them. And then just a generation later, probably not more, you get to Bloom Mound and the bison disappear. But the trade ceramics increase even further, and then there's whopping evidence of warfare. Mutilated bodies, unburied bodies, burned bodies, and then abandonment. So you want a fairy tale that I'm still sort of trying to find different ways to get at. I think what you have are these dual economies all around the southern plains, competing for access to the bison herd. I think the major target, actually, to some extent, is meat, but I think hides are far more important. There's a lot of evidence of burgeoning warfare all over the place, and the introduction of recurved bows. And they used reed armor up till this period, and then switched to bison hide shields, which were made, you needed an entire bison hide to make a single shield. And it was done by taking the hide off the back of the animal, folding it in half and gluing and putting a frame on it. So these were body shields that went from the ground probably almost up to shoulder height. And as defense against these recurved bows, which the Spanish observed and called Turkish bows. So I think one of the major incentives for this conflict was over all these dual economies all around and even along the rivers in the southern plains, competing for access to these herds. And if you think about it, the communities that get to the herd first have a real advantage, because once you disturb the bison, it becomes very difficult to drive them and hunt them again on foot until the herds calm down. And they often may move 10, 15, 20 miles away before they calm down and reach the point where you can manipulate them again. So who gets there first really matters. They may also have been competing for trading partners in the Pueblos with communities to the east of the plains as well. So what did we learn at Roswell? So some of the major findings. One is that bison hunting kicks in well before the interaction itself starts, but that Plains-Pueblo interaction, at least as seen from Roswell, kicks in well before the protohistoric, and that it involves dual economies, not bison hunting specialists. These are people that are doing a lot of farming, but I think seasonally, partially, perhaps entirely abandon their villages, go out in the plains to hunt bison, and then go off and trade. And then they get embroiled in warfare, and eventually, meaning by the early to mid 1400s. That whole area, the entire southern plains, is basically abandoned. And then that vacuum is filled by the Athabascans, probably around 1450. I'm going to skip the part on Pecos because this is more aimed at people who are specialists in southwestern prehistory. And this is my ideal mountain. It's called the Capitan. It's the only mountain in the Rockies in New Mexico that sticks east-west instead of north-south. It's the closest one to Roswell. And this is looking at it from Bloom Mound. And this is the old military Apache road that led from the Pecos to the Mescalero Apache Reservation. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to take questions. I probably should stop screen sharing here. Let's try this.
There we go. Now I can see everybody.
All right.
Thank you, John, very much.
Yeah.
That was very interesting.
So,
Anybody have any questions, or can you take some questions?
oh, as I said, I have no schedule. So, you know, I'm happy to stay here as long as people want.
Okay.
Admittedly, it's a bit foreign for a Michigan ArcSoc talk, but for those with an interest in Paleo-Indian, this business about just how much meat you can eat, you know, caribou, mammoth, mastodon, and so forth, it does raise some interesting questions. And it wouldn't surprise me if lots of carcasses are just stripped for certain things and then abandoned. And it's not a mystery. They simply can't use it.
Okay. Anybody have any more questions for John?
Is there any relationship of these pueblos to the more modern ones, the Coma and things like that are up on the mesas? Were they around at that far back or not?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I very carefully avoided that question because it's really sensitive. And no matter what you say in a way, if you say it in print at least, it can have consequences that one may not want to live with. You know, we used to use the term in the Southwest, Anasazi, and it was a terrible term because it's a Navajo word that means enemy. And to call the Pueblos enemy using a Navajo term was not very satisfactory. So it's now fashionable to call them ancestral Pueblo. But I think that's a terrible term scientifically because it puts the cart before the horse. We don't know who's ancestral to whom. We need genetic studies and other things to determine that, and even that may be ambiguous. And a lot of these Pueblos modern Pueblos are the result of absorbing lots of different groups. And many of them have clan histories where the clans migrated separately. They're certainly well aware in their oral traditions of these clan migrations. So the modern Pueblos that we see aren't necessarily prehistoric, although they certainly have prehistoric ancestors. And in fact, these clans know where their ancestral villages were, and they often maintain shrines on them. So, but when you get out to Roswell, I'm out in the boonies, and everybody and nobody has a claim on the area. The Mescalero have a claim on the area, obviously, because they're the closest tribe today. But Isleta Pueblo, which is at the south end of Albuquerque, also views that area as theirs. And so do the Hopi in Arizona, and so do the Pawnee in eastern Nebraska, and the Kiowa and the Comanche. And I have no reliable way of getting at ethnicity. And so in fact, I have a book that's coming out probably in the next year through the University of Utah. And one of the early sections in the book is carefully laying out why I'm avoiding that whole topic. Because no matter what I say, if I speculate, it's probably wrong. And so, you know, it's difficult to answer. They certainly are interacting with Pueblos in the Rio Grande. There's no question about it. The dominant ceramic at Henderson and at Bloom is El Paso polychrome. It's also the dominant ceramic at Casas Grandes, which is 400 miles away. And you know damn well they didn't all speak the same language. They may have even been in different language families. So it's dangerous to speculate. And I don't mean this as a put down of your question, not at all. It's a great question. It's one that a lot of archaeologists like to speculate, and I think it's one that I would personally think is really dangerous. I can see interaction, but I have no idea what that means in terms of language, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of biological relationships. And there are a lot of Pueblo-like things, but there are a lot of things happening there that are very un-Pueblo, like the eating of dogs in ceremonial feasts is not a Pueblo, typical, at least modern Pueblo feature. I think the El Paso vessels, there's a lot of speculation on this. We need biochemists to sort this out for us. We think they may have been brewing a corn liquor or a mezcal, and these were used in ceremonial occasions. And alcohol, there's no real tradition of alcohol in the Pueblos. Peyote and other things were important, but not alcohol, not corn beers or anything like that. Whereas when you look at the distribution among tribes to the south in northern Mexico and elsewhere, these were very important in rituals and ceremonies and so forth. So those are linkages away from the modern Rio Grande Pueblos, let's put it that way. But then there are other features that link us. For example, there's a lot of horned serpent symbolism in southeastern New Mexico. It's a water serpent. Now it looks a little bit like Quetzalcoatl in Mexico and so forth, but it's an important Tewa Pueblo symbol. But I hesitate to link it with the Tewa either, because you can find this, you find it in Mississippian sites in the southeast. So it's a fascinating topic and one that archaeologists are really ill-equipped to deal with.
Has there been any DNA analysis of the human bones, like from the sites that you were working on, that you could use to compare to the modern?
Not from ours, and I'm forbidden to do it right now. Understandably so. This is not said with bitterness. It's just the reality of it. I don't know what the fate. I have a lot of skeletons here. They're under the control of our NACPRA office. And I suspect right now they're focused on Michigan skeletal material, repatriating that. I don't know when the Southwest will come online, probably in the next 5 years or so. And so the material, the human remains will very likely be reburied. Whether communities, indigenous communities in the Southwest in that 5-year interim would have any interest in DNA studies, I don't know. I would, on one hand, I'd love to see it done. On the other hand, I'm definitely not pushing it. So I have the feeling it won't happen. So, some of these questions, I don't know whether DNA would resolve it either. There could be a lot of interbreeding which would show up in the DNA, but it might still tell you nothing about the language group or the cultural boundaries that they recognize and so forth. So it's a wonderful, fascinating topic, and archaeologists, in my view, are pretty helpless in really dealing with it.
I'd like to ask one question about the Anasazi, because as I've come to learn them, they were more around the 1100 ADs and would precede some of what you're talking about here. If you've been to Chaco or other areas like that, it's a very different society than what you've been discussing as the hunter-gatherers, because they were more farmers at that point, if you will, as opposed to the meat hunters, as you've described. You have any comments on that?
Right. Well, oh yeah. I mean, I like what I don't call marginal, but peripheral. I love peripheries. The problem if you dig in a place like Chaco is you're so overwhelmed with material, you spend the rest of your life just counting and weighing. Whereas I don't have to go through quite as much of that, and I can get to the problems a little faster. But I mean, there's there's a 13,000 year, at least a 13,000 year archaeological record, not in Roswell, but in that area. I mean, there have been people there the whole time. But most of the time, it looks like they were hunter-gatherers, probably doing some cultivation from roughly the time of Christ onward. We don't know how much because there has not been that much archaeology done out there. Most of the archaeology has tended to target the picturesque, being maybe a little uncharitable, but if it gets on the cover of National Geographic, there's a lot of money that gets attracted to it as well. And so the cliff dwellings and the Chacos and so forth attract a lot more attention. And Roswell is certainly not a spectacular place to go. As I say, it'll never make the cover of National Geographic. Now, but anyway, in terms of a more serious answer to this, there's occupation throughout the southeastern New Mexico that parallels time-wise what's going on in Chaco and elsewhere. But I think they are far more mobile, maybe not full-time hunter-gatherers, but doing some very limited cultivation. We just don't have a lot of data. But there are no, prior to about 1200, what we have are traced mostly campsites with no evidence of permanent architecture. So it's a very different picture than what you see sort of in the heartland of the the Colorado Plateau, basically from Mesa Verde, Chaco, and down into the Rio Grande. But they're clearly interacting. We have a lot of ceramics that come from that area. I even have a large biface on flint from Wyoming. And I have marine shell from the Gulf of Cortez. And I have copper bells from West Mexico. I mean, there's stuff moving all over the place. But where I'm working, you're not dealing with these massive multi-story pueblos. You're dealing with structures that are, in fact, a lot of them may have been jacal or wattle and knob, where you put up a branch framework and then plastered over with mud. And in fact, the Spanish referred to these things as rancherias rather than pueblos.
Thank you.
But we have a lot of this.
Go ahead. I was going to ask, back at the start of the presentation when you were talking about the large disparity between male and female bison kill and the disparities in the usage of those carcasses. Was there any indication there that the females might have been kills that were just incidental to harvesting the juveniles?
Interesting. I mean, they're all blended together. That is, we had clusters of animals, and typically there'd be 1 or 2 cows and 5 or 6 bulls, something like that. Some juveniles. We had some fetuses, full-term fetuses, and so forth, but they were deliberately going after bulls, but they did get some cows. I don't think they're incidental. I have the feeling that if they could have avoided taking the cows, they perhaps would have. But when you're using a communal technique for hunting, sometimes you can't be as selective as you want. There's a lot of early historic descriptions before in the boreal forest and northern plains areas in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and so forth. Some of the early European explorers like Alexander Henry and Alexander Henry Jr. They observed bison kills actually happening And what they described was, they were after a herd of cows, but they got some bulls, but they just let them rot in the corral that they drove them into because they didn't want to use them. And I suspect it's because at the time of year they were doing it, the bulls weren't worth worrying about. And in fact, in one kill, Henry describes that the stench was so bad they abandoned the pound, the corral, and built the new one because there was so much rotting bison in there that they weren't using, mostly bulls. So, the hard part for me in that is, of abandoning or discarding meat is separating what is Aboriginal, indigenous, pre-fur trade versus fur trade. Because once you get into the fur trade and when it's up and running big time, they're starting the fur trade, the trading posts had certain things they wanted and things they didn't want. And so a lot of the hunting was aimed at, well, this is what I can get money for, or I can get, guns for, or I can get whatever, flour for. And it's hard to distinguish those. But when you go back to the earliest records, when Hudson Bay, for example, was just beginning, one of them is a guy named Samuel Huron, who was the first European, as far as I know, to reach the Copper River north of the Copper Mine River north of the Arctic Circle. He was accompanied by a band of Chippewyans, and he said it drove them nuts. They kept killing animals and only taking fat parts from them, and they weren't part of the fur trade yet. I mean, he was trying to get them interested in it, basically, which is why he was there. And it's things like that that make me think that a lot of these unused or partially used carcasses are because they just weren't nutritionally viable.
Okay.
I don't know if that really answers what you were after, but
Okay, thank you very much. And it is 9 o'clock, so I guess unless someone else has a question. Yes, anybody?
any others? Otherwise, you can always email me.
You can email. Yep. Yeah. It's really great for you to do this for us, John, and really appreciate it.
So
And
if you can get me off the web if you want my email, or anyone on the board at HVC can give you my email. I'm happy to answer questions that way as well.
great. Okay. Well, thank you. And
All right, well, thanks a lot.
hope we'll see everybody, including John, if he's interested, at our March 18th meeting. We'll be doing Zoom for a while, but at least it was snowing tonight and we're comfortably home. We can do this all without having to go anywhere.
All right, well, take care, everyone. Stay well.
You got
Thank
great
you.
attention. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everybody. How do I do this?